In this video, we're going to look at safe space policies, particularly those that focus on the shelter operations. All policies and procedures are found in the shelter binder. Please review them when you have a chance and talk to the shelter operations manager if you have any questions. Let's start with the policy regarding who gets admitted to safe space. Safe space is a low barrier shelter, but guests are expected to meet minimum criteria for admission. We do not require drug or alcohol testing or identification. Guests must agree to follow the rules, and they must be able to take care of themselves. Safe space is not a good fit for minors, for families with children, or for those with severe mobility issues, but exceptions can be made by the shelter operations manager. Guests must be able to care for themselves, including the ability to physically transfer to a cot or bed, to use the bathroom without assistance, to use safe space transportation, and to eat without assistance. All guests must register through the intake center. Anyone who shows up directly at the shelter will not be admitted unless it has been prearranged and approved by the shelter operations manager for specific circumstances. These might include a confirmed job or school schedule, guests who are volunteering to help with shelter setup, particularly on move-in day, things like that. But as a general rule, all guests must go through the intake center. To be allowed to stay at safe space, a guest must agree to the code of conduct. And while pets are allowed, they too must comply with minimum safety criteria. Any animals must be able to stay under the control of its owner, and they must not growl or make other threats either to people or to other animals. Safe space does not discriminate in its services on the basis of race, color, religion, creed, gender, gender expression, age, national origin, ancestry, marital status, sexual orientation, or military status in any of our activities or operations. Guests must sign the code of conduct. This takes place during their initial intake, and these rules are also posted both at the intake center and at the shelters. Guests must acknowledge that safe space is a zero tolerance zone for, first, violence, either verbal or physical. That means no bullying, no threats, no teasing, no shoving, no pushing, no hitting, no damaging property. Guests must also acknowledge that it's a zero tolerance zone for alcohol, illegal drugs, or weapons that are not placed in belongings bags and handed over at intake to be stored overnight. Again, no exceptions. In the code of conduct, guests must agree to follow all safe space rules, to comply with any directions given by safe space volunteers, and again, to give up all personal property, and that includes any alcohol, illegal drugs, or weapons. Guests must acknowledge that non-compliance with these rules may result in exclusion from the shelter for a time to be determined by the shelter operations team. The goal of safe space is to provide a safe and peaceful living environment and to treat everyone with respect, dignity, courtesy, and honesty. Excluding someone is a last resort. We really don't want to do it. But guests and potential guests may be excluded from the shelter for violating our rules, particularly where it impacts the safety of others. Exclusion or ejection is based on violation of the rules, and this is determined by the shelter operations manager. These are regularly discussed by the entire shop team. We try to make sure that we're applying all the rules fairly and that we're applying them consistently to all guests. The shelter operations manager may give a one-time warning prior to excluding a guest. As a general rule, though, guests will be excluded for 7 days for first offenses such as possession of illegal drugs or alcohol at the intake center that is after the property storage process or at any shelter site. Also, any form of physical or verbal threats towards guests or volunteers, and for minor hands-on physical assault, shoving, pushing, grabbing. For major physical assault, hitting, kicking, biting, guests may be excluded for a 30-day period. All exclusions will be doubled for a second offense, and a third offense could result in exclusion for the rest of the season. Guests can be readmitted after they're excluded, but prior to being readmitted, the person must meet with one of the shelter operations managers who will make the decision regarding readmission. Any person who is readmitted must again sign the Code of Conduct. Generally, Safe Space will only serve people who are at least 18 years old. Any exceptions to this must be approved by the shelter operations manager, and they're going to be based on circumstances and the needs of the individual. We may receive requests for shelters both from adults who are accompanied by minor children or from unaccompanied minors. Parents with minor children will be offered shelter just like any other guest, but if a family registers at intake, the shelter operations manager should notify the evening team leader. The evening team leader should then place the family's bedding in a place that, to the extent possible, is separate from other guests and is in sight of the shelter crew. The presence of this family should be passed on to later shelter shifts. Parents are responsible for decisions regarding their children within Safe Space rules, and they must ensure control of their children. All shelter volunteers should be attentive to any red flags regarding neglect, abuse, or other issues. These should be reported to the shelter operations manager, and if appropriate, they'll be reported to appropriate authorities. We've only had a few cases where unaccompanied minors have come to shelter, but it could happen. The decision of whether to provide shelter to an unaccompanied minor will be made by the shelter operations manager, who should be notified by the intake team leader if there's a minor seeking shelter. The shelter operations manager should first determine if the minor is willing to be referred to the HART team, that is the Homeless Emergency Action Response Team. HART serves minor homeless youth. It has a 24-hour mobile crisis intervention, access to temporary shelter, social service advocacy, counseling, family reunification, and support with basic items such as food, clothing, and hygiene. The 24/7 phone number for HART is programmed into the Safe Space phones. If HART is unable to help, or if the minor is unwilling to allow this referral, then the shelter operations manager may allow the minor to stay based on a judgment that it's in the best interest of the minor. Some of the factors that will come into this include weather conditions, other safety conditions, and lack of alternatives. If shelter is to be provided to an unaccompanied minor, the shelter operations team leader should be notified, and this information should be passed to later shelter shifts. Again, the shelter team leader should place the minor's bedding in a place that, to the extent possible, is separate from other guests and in sight of the monitors. Safe Space is not a medical care provider. However, medical conditions do show up. If in doubt, call 911. Don't think about it, call. Safe Space volunteers should not provide medical assistance, but they can assist guests with their own care. We can offer over-the-counter medicines for cold symptoms, that is coughing, sneezing, etc., for diarrhea or nausea, and for minor pain. Any first aid supplies should be used by the guest without assistance. If guests are unable to do so, transportation can be arranged to a medical facility. Again, call 911 for any trouble breathing, chest pain, other severe pain, loss of consciousness or disorientation, or if in doubt. Anytime you call 911, please notify the shelter operations manager afterwards. For other non-emergent medical conditions, guests may be offered transportation to Enloe at any time and then back to the shelter. This, like any other transportation, must be arranged by the shelter operations manager. The next video will look at general administrative issues.